In 1944, the United States Army handed its soldiers the finest equipment on Earth, and then watched them throw half of it away. Because the men in the foxholes knew something the generals in London did not. The rulebook was written by people who had never been pinned down in a hedgerow at 10 yards. So the GIIS built their own tools out of whatever the war left lying around. Enemy scrap, wrecked jeeps, beach obstacles, tin cans. Number 7 on this list was so effective that General Patton flat out banned it. And number 1, a sergeant welded it together from a German roadblock. And Eisenhower later said it may have saved the entire Normandy breakout. Some of these broke the rules of war. Some broke Army regulations. All of them worked. Hit subscribe, because official history left these out on purpose. Let's count down from 25. Number 25, the sharpened entrenching tool. Every GI carried a folding shovel to dig his foxhole, and somewhere between Sicily and the Siegfried Line, thousands of them turned that shovel into something the Geneva Conventions never imagined. Men took a file to the flat edge of the blade until it held a rough cutting edge, then locked the head at a right angle so it swung like a hatchet. In the close, muddy chaos of a night trench raid, a rifle was too long and a bayonet too slow. The shovel was already in your hand. Veterans of the Hurtgen Forest spoke of it in low voices decades later, the one weapon they would not describe in detail to their grandchildren. It required no supply chain, no requisition form, no armorer. A dull tool for moving dirt became, with 20 minutes and a whetstone, the most personal weapon a man could carry. The Army issued it to dig. The soldier decided what else it was for. Number 24, the sock and the sand. It sounds like something a schoolyard bully would dream up, and that is exactly why it worked. A GI would fill the toe of a spare wool sock with wet sand or a fistful of gravel, knot it tight, and drop it into a jacket pocket. What he carried was a blackjack, a sap, silent and deniable and utterly against every rule of engagement. It left no bullet, made no sound, and could be dumped in a ditch the moment it was used. In occupied towns and along blacked-out roads, sentries and scouts favored it for the work nobody wrote reports about. Military police hated it precisely because it was invisible. There was no serial number to trace, no casing to find. Boxers and street kids from a dozen American cities already knew the trick from home. The war just gave them a reason. A darned sock, a handful of the earth they were fighting over, and the oldest weapon in the book was reborn in a foxhole. Number 23, the nail-studded trench club. Trench raiding was supposed to have ended in 1918. Somebody forgot to tell the men of 1944. When a patrol needed to cross no man's land and come back with a prisoner, or without one, they wanted a tool that made no muzzle flash to give away the whole squad. So they cut a length of hardwood, a pick handle or a chair leg, and drove nails or spent cartridge cases through the business end. Some wrapped the grip in tape or leather for a surer hold in the rain. The result was medieval, and that was the point. Oral histories from combat engineers describe men who kept one lashed to their pack the entire war, never firing it, never needing to. It was the threat as much as the tool. In the silence of a raid, where a single shot could bring down artillery on your own head, the ugliest weapon in the arsenal was also the quietest. War had spun the calendar backward 800 years. Number 22, brass knuckles cast from scrap. In the rear areas, wherever a motor pool had a welding torch and a mold, GIS quietly turned melted-down brass fittings and shell casings into knuckle dusters. The technique was old news to any man who had grown up around a foundry. You made a mold from packed sand, poured the molten metal, let it cool, and filed it smooth. What came out was strictly forbidden by regulation, a weapon with no purpose but one. Some were beautiful, engraved with a unit number or a sweetheart's initials, carried more as a talisman than a tool. Others were purely business, worn on knuckles that had already seen 100 bar fights back home. Provost marshals confiscated crates of them and never made a dent in the supply because the raw material was everywhere and the skill was in every third soldier's hands. The Arma melted brass for shell casings. The soldiers melted it for something the Army would have court-martialed them for owning. Number 21. Fighting knives ground from leaf springs. The Army issued knives, but never enough, and rarely the ones men actually wanted. So the GIS made their own from the best steel available, which happened to be lying under every wrecked truck in the theater. A leaf spring from a broken-down vehicle was spring steel, tough and springy, the ideal stock for a blade. In field workshops, mechanics heated, hammered, and ground these springs into fighting knives with a balance no factory tool could match. Files became daggers. Bayonets were cut down and reshaped. Everyone was unique, sized to the hand that made it, and prized far above the standard issue. Marines in the Pacific traded them like currency. A good field-forged knife could be swapped for a bottle, a watch, or a week of somebody else's guard duty. The men who carried them into the jungle knew the difference between a blade a bureaucrat approved and a blade a machinist made for a friend who might not come back. Number 20. The sawed-off trench broom. The pump shotgun was already loathed by the German High Command, who protested in 1918 that it violated the laws of war. American GIS answered that objection the way soldiers always do. They made it worse. In the close fighting of towns and jungle, men cut the barrel and stock down until the weapon was barely 2 feet long, a devastating close-range tool that could sweep a room or a foxhole in a heartbeat. It was against regulation, and in enemy hands a captured man carrying one could expect no mercy. But at bad breath distance, nothing on the battlefield was more final. Combat engineers clearing bunkers and Marines clearing caves carried them illegally and gratefully. The buckshot spread meant you did not have to aim so much as point. A hunting gun from back home, chopped down with a hacksaw in a supply tent, became the most feared close-quarters weapon a squad could carry into a doorway. Number 19. The bullet the Hague banned. Here the line into genuinely illegal is crossed, and every soldier who did it knew exactly what he was doing. The Hague Convention of 1899 outlawed expanding ammunition, rounds designed to deform on impact. Yet in the field, men occasionally took a file to the tip of a full metal jacket round, an old and forbidden trick meant to make a bullet do far more damage than the treaty allowed. It was a hanging offense in spirit, a violation that could see a captured man treated as a criminal rather than a prisoner. Officers who found it in their units came down hard because it endangered every American who might later fall into enemy hands. This one carries no admiration, only the grim record of what desperation and fear will drive men to do when they believe the enemy has already broken the rules first. It stands on this list not as ingenuity, but as a warning about how quickly the rule book burns away at the front. Number 18. Turning the enemy's own guns around. The most abundant scrap on any battlefield was the enemy's discarded weaponry, and GIS helped themselves without a second thought. A German submachine gun with its high rate of fire, a Luger as a trophy sidearm, an enemy machine gun bolted onto a Jeep, all were scooped up and pressed into American service. It was technically against orders. Using captured weapons risked friendly fire, since the distinctive sound of an enemy gun could draw fire from your own side, and a man caught with enemy arms could be shot as a saboteur. But ammunition was ammunition, and a working gun was a working gun. Paratroopers who landed scattered and short on supply often fought their first hours with whatever they could pick up off the ground. The enemy spent years and fortunes building those weapons. The GI simply picked them up, checked the action, and turned them back the way they came, free of charge. Number 17. Foxhole armor from scrap steel. Long before the word flak jacket meant anything, GIS were bolting their own protection out of whatever plate they could scrounge. Men lined the floors of Jeeps and half-tracks with sandbags against mines. They welded scavenged steel to the sides of gun positions. Machine gun crews built little shields from wrecked vehicle panels and stood them in front of their positions, an extra inch of steel between them and a sniper. None of it was issued. Ordnance officers grumbled that the weight was pointless and the steel was better used elsewhere. The men who unfolded a scrap plate in front of their foxhole and lived through the next barrage disagreed. It was the quiet arithmetic of the front line. A pound of salvaged metal you scrounged yourself was worth more than a promise of better equipment that might arrive next month. So they scrounged, and they welded, and they lived. Number 16. Homemade breaching charges. German defenses leaned on barbed wire, thick belts of it strung across every likely approach. The Army made a purpose-built tool to blow a path through, but there was never enough of it where and when it was needed. So combat engineers improvised their own breaching charges in the field, rigging explosives into lengths of pipe or bundling them to shove under the wire and clear a lane for the infantry. The work was murderously dangerous, done under fire, often at night, with hands that had to stay steady while machine guns searched the dark. The men who did it were among the bravest and shortest lived on the battlefield. When a lane opened and a company poured through a gap that had not existed a minute before, few of them stopped to think about the sappers crouched in the mud who had made the hole. The Army gave them a manual. The war made them inventors. Number 15. Field-rigged satchel charges. When a concrete bunker or a fortified house had to go, GIS often could not wait for the perfect ordnance to be delivered. So they built their own demolition packs in the field, bundling explosives into a satchel or a haversack that a running man could heave and then dive for cover. Assault teams used them to crack pillboxes along the Atlantic Wall and to collapse cave mouths in the Pacific. The job called for a man to sprint across open ground toward the one position on the battlefield most likely to kill him, place the charge, and run. Medals of honor were earned this way, and so were unmarked graves. The improvised satchel was crude, heavy, and terrifying to carry, but against a fortress that shrugged off artillery, it was often the only answer a rifle company had. The Army built the fortress's killers by the thousand. The GI built the ones that were there when he needed them. Number 14. The Molotov cocktail. No weapon on this list has a longer or darker legend. When American units found themselves short of anti-tank weapons, especially early in the war and in the Pacific, Men fell back on the improvised firebomb the world had already named after a Soviet foreign minister. It was the ultimate expression of scrap warfare, built from a bottle and fuel scrounged from a vehicle. And it turned an ordinary object into a desperate last resort against armor. It was never a fair fight. To use one meant letting a tank come close enough that a thrown bottle could reach it, which meant letting it come close enough to kill you first. Militias, partisans, and cornered infantry all reached for it in the same moment of desperation. The Molotov appears here not as a clever gadget, but as a measure of how bad things could get when trained soldiers of the most industrialized army on Earth were reduced to throwing fire by hand. Number 13. The fuel drum flame trap. In the Pacific and along fortified lines, defenders sometimes rigged barrels of fuel into buried flame traps, positioned to be triggered when the enemy came into a killing zone. Nicknamed foo gas by the men who built and feared it, this improvised device turned a drum of scrounged fuel and a defended slope into a wall of fire. It was a defensive weapon of last resort, ringing a perimeter that had to hold at all costs. Marines dug in against banzai charges spoke of the strange comfort of knowing the trap was out there in the dark and the horror of the moment it went off. It was crude, unpredictable, and against every convention of clean warfare, but on a night when a position was about to be overrun, cleanliness was not the priority. The industrial fuel that moved the war's engines became, in a buried drum, the thing that held a line no man could otherwise hold. Number 12. The booby trap. The most patient weapon of the war never moved. GIS and their enemies became experts at rigging booby traps from spare grenades and tripwires, leaving them behind in abandoned positions, on doorways, on anything a curious or exhausted soldier might disturb. The device did the fighting while its maker slept miles away. It was psychological as much as physical. Once men learned that a dropped pistol or an unlatched door might be wired, they touched nothing, entered nowhere, and every advance slowed to a crawl of suspicion. Rearguard actions relied on it to buy time. The genius and the cruelty was that the trap forced the enemy to fear the ordinary world itself. Combat engineers spent as much time disarming these silent gifts as laying them. A single tripwire could hold up an entire company, not because it was likely to kill them, but because it might. Fear, strung on a thin wire, did the work of a platoon. Number 11. The improvised anti-tank charge. Before every rifle squad had a rocket launcher, the infantryman's answer to a tank was often something he built or carried himself and delivered by hand. Men bundled charges to jam in a track or drop against thin-top armor, closing the last deadly yards on foot while the crew inside tried to kill them. It was the most terrifying job in the infantry, a duel between one man with a homemade charge and 30 tons of steel and cannon. Success meant a burning tank and a story told for the rest of your life. Failure meant nothing at all. The men who did it were volunteers, or the last ones left, and they knew the odds. When the enemy's armor broke through and the anti-tank guns were gone, the difference between a rout and a stand was a handful of soldiers willing to walk toward a tank carrying something they had assembled that morning. Number 10. The field-modified gun mount. The Jeep and the half-track came off the assembly line, ready for a lot of things, but the men who drove them were never satisfied. Across every theater, GIS welded, bolted, and jury-rigged extra machine gun mounts onto vehicles that were never designed to carry them. A recon jeep might bristle with 2 or 3 guns. It was never issued. A truck became a gun platform overnight. Motor pool mechanics, working from nothing but a torch and an idea, gave ordinary vehicles the teeth of a fighting machine. The Army's tables of equipment said 1 gun. The crew said more. When a column got ambushed on a narrow road, the difference between survival and slaughter was often those extra, unauthorized barrels swinging into action. It was scrapyard engineering at its finest, and it followed a rule as old as war itself. A soldier will always find a way to bring more firepower than the paperwork allows. Number 9. The spare track wall. By late 1944, American tankers had learned to fear the German 88 and the handheld rockets that could gut a Sherman at close range, and they responded the only way they could, with their own hands. The most common trick was to weld spare track links, the heavy steel segments of a tank's own tread, all over the hull and turret. A Sherman could end up looking scaled like a reptile, every flat surface studded with links. Crews swore by it. Ordnance officers were skeptical, and they had a point. Track steel was not armor grade, and testing suggested it did little against a full-power armor-piercing round. But belief is its own kind of armor. A crew that felt safer fought bolder, and in the hedgerows and town-to-town grind of the drive into Germany, a little courage bolted to the front plate was worth the wait. They built it from the very treads they rolled on. Number 8. Logs, concrete, and the Great Debate. When steel ran short, GIS armored their tanks with the forest and the road. Some crews strapped whole logs and timber to the sides of their Shermans, thick wood that might, they hoped, slow a shaped charge before it reached the hull. Others, more rarely, troweled a layer of concrete over the front plate and the roof above the driver, poured and shaped in the field like a mason's work. Both methods had their believers and their doubters. Testing later showed a full-power round punched through a log with little trouble, and concrete could shatter into deadly fragments of its own. But on a cold morning facing a hidden gun, a foot of oak looked a lot better than bare steel. It was resourcefulness at its most literal. A tank crew stripping a Norman woodlot or a wrecked building to wrap their thin-skinned ride in whatever the earth would give them. Number 7. Sandbags and the general who said no. Here is the one that started a war within the war. Desperate for protection, Sherman crews began stacking sandbags across the front, sides, and turrets of their tanks, sometimes up to 170 bags on a single machine, adding as much as 3 tons of dead weight. Division workshops even built frames to hold them. The men were convinced it saved lives. General George Patton was convinced it did the opposite. He believed the sandbags offered little real protection against the high-velocity guns of 1944, and that the enormous added weight wrecked the Sherman's engines and transmissions, robbing it of the speed that was its greatest asset. By the summer of 1944, Patton banned the practice outright in his Third Army. His ordnance officers backed him, and still crews found ways around the order, because a frightened man trusts the sandbag he can see over the statistic he cannot. The argument was never fully settled. It just ran out of war. Number 6. Armor cut from the dead. Eventually, the Army made peace with the men's hunger for protection and pointed them at the best scrap of all. Knocked-out tanks, both American and German, littered every battlefield, and each wreck was a slab of genuine armor-grade steel waiting to be reborn. In the spring of 1945, as losses mounted, workshops of the Third Army began cannibalizing plate from destroyed vehicles and welding it onto the survivors, patching the weak spots around hatches, the flat sides, the thin flanks. Unlike sandbags or track links, this was the real thing. Steel designed to stop a shell, and it worked. Some tanks were plated with armor stripped from captured German factories. A Sherman that limped into a repair depot ordinary could roll out looking like a mobile fortress. There was a grim poetry to it. The tanks that had died gave their armor to the tanks still fighting so that the men inside might have a better chance of driving home. Number 5. Curtains of steel in the sky. The improvisers were not only on the ground. American bomber crews flying into some of the deadliest flak ever fired took protection into their own hands the same way the tankers did. Men scrounged sheets of steel and lengths of spare armor plate and laid them across the cockpit floor, under their seats, anywhere a piece of shrapnel might come up from below. Waist gunners, standing exposed at open windows, draped extra plate around their positions. Some men famously sat on it, protecting the part of themselves they were least willing to donate to the war effort. None of it was standard issue, and the added weight cost fuel and altitude, which the brass never loved. But at 20,000 feet, with the sky full of black bursts, an airman would trade a little range for a little steel every single time. The bombers were built to carry bombs. The crews rebuilt them to carry a little hope home. Number 4. The rocket, re-rigged. The bazooka gave the infantry a fighting chance against armor, and naturally the men were not content to use it as the manual described. GIS improvised launch rigs and mounts, bolting rocket tubes to jeeps, to walls, to whatever would hold them, and firing them in ways the designers never intended. Some units clustered tubes to throw a barrage. Others rigged them for angles and positions no field manual covered. The rocket itself was a marvel of the war, a shoulder-fired weapon that let one man threaten a tank, but the soldiers who carried it kept finding new jobs for it, against bunkers, against buildings, against dug-in positions that a single rifleman could now crack open. It was the American genius for improvisation applied to the most modern tool in the kit. Hand a GI a rocket launcher and a length of scrap, and by evening he had thought of 3 things to do with it that no engineer in ordnance had imagined. Number 3. The tank that cleared its own road. Some of the most valuable scrap machines of the war were built to clear the path for everyone else. Combat engineers bolted bulldozer blades and improvised rams onto tanks, turning a fighting vehicle into an armored earth mover that could shove aside obstacles, fill craters, and knock through barriers while under fire. Where infantry and armor bogged down against roadblocks and rubble, these hybrid machines cleared the way and kept the advance moving. The work was done in the open, in range of every gun the enemy could bring to bear, and the crews earned every yard. Much of the equipment was improvised or field modified from whatever a division's workshop could weld together. It was not glamorous. No songs were written about the men who filled the ditch so the tanks could cross. But a stalled advance is a dying advance, and these scrap-built machines kept the whole army rolling forward when the ground itself fought back. Number 2. The enemy's cannon turned around. When American units captured enemy artillery, they did not always ship it to the rear. Sometimes, if the guns were sound and the ammunition was there, they turned them around and fired them right back. GIS improvised carriages, mounts, and firing setups to press salvaged and enemy artillery into American service, adding firepower that no supply ship had to carry across an ocean. It took nerve and know-how. An unfamiliar gun could kill its own crew if mishandled, and firing captured ordnance was a fine way to draw counter-battery fire from both sides at once. But a working cannon is a working cannon, and free firepower sitting in a captured battery was too good to leave behind. There was a deep satisfaction in it too, the war's oldest revenge. The enemy hauled those guns across a continent to kill Americans. The Americans simply swung them around and sent the shells back where they came from. Number 1. The Rhino, built from a German roadblock, and in first place, the single greatest piece of scrapyard genius of the entire war. After D-Day, American tanks found themselves trapped in the Norman bocage, ancient earthen hedgerows up to 15 feet high and 12 feet thick. When a Sherman tried to climb over one, it reared up and exposed its thin belly armor to every gun in the field. For more than 5 weeks, the hedgerows stopped an army cold. Then a young sergeant named Curtis Cullen from Cranford, New Jersey, listened to a fellow soldier joke that they ought to just put saw teeth on the front of the tanks. Everyone laughed. Cullen didn't. He gathered up the steel from the Germans' own beach obstacles, the anti-tank hedgehogs scattered across Normandy, and welded 4 steel tusks to the front of a Sherman. The tank charged a hedgerow at 10 miles an hour, bored in, and burst straight through in a canopy of dirt, belly protected, guns level. General Bradley watched a demonstration and, in his own words, watched in awe. He ordered every ordnance unit in the Army onto round-the-clock production. Roughly 3 of every 5 American tanks in the First Army were fitted with the device before the Great Breakout, Operation Cobra. The men called them Rhinos. Eisenhower himself, 20 years later, told the story to the nation and credited that little sergeant with restoring the Army's ability to maneuver. Cullen was awarded the Legion of Merit. He had turned the enemy's own roadblock into the key that unlocked France, and he built it in a field, out of scrap, with a welding torch and an idea no one else took seriously. From a sharpened shovel to a sergeant's welded tusks, these 25 weapons share one thing. They were built by the men who had to use them out of the wreckage of the war itself. The rulebook said no. The scrapyard said yes. And more than once, it was the illegal, improvised, held together with a prayer weapon that turned the day. Tell me in the comments which one surprised you most, and which one your own grandfather might have carried. He knew. Now you do too.